When I say that long ballots poison democracy, I mean they consistently undermine the core principles of fair elections and honest representation of voter intentions. But here's a key distinction. Long ballots aren't the root of the problem because there's no such thing as long ballot bias in isolation. Instead, long ballots act as amplifiers. They take existing problems and make them worse. They increase complexity, raise error rates, and intensify systematic biased voting patterns. And the longer the ballot, the worse the problem gets. The real threat is a lethal combination of alphabetical order with long ballots. Together, they exert a distortion worse than the sum of their parts that can change electoral outcomes, even in races that should have been decided by a larger margin of percentage. Fortunately, we're going to have to geek out for just a moment so that we can really come to a proper understanding about long ballots. In social sciences and psychological research, we talk about causes and effects. So causal variables that have some sort of impact on the world. And there's an important distinction to make, and it's one between a mediator variable and a moderator variable. This is a very important distinction. So here's the definition. So the mediator variable is a variable that sits between the cause and effect relationship, and whatever is driving the outcome somehow flows through that other mediator variable. However, a moderator variable is different. That's one where the cause to effect relationship is changed fundamentally by this other variable. Sometimes it will get worse. Sometimes it will get reduced. I can have all sorts of unexpected outcomes. So the moderator variable, think of it like a little switch that when it's turned on, you don't know what's going to happen, but it will follow some systematic pattern that we can come to understand and model in the social sciences. Now, in the case of position bias, it works like this. We take our alphabetical order, and then that's what causes the position bias in the election. However, the long ballot that exists is one that will change the outcome. So by its presence, it can turn up the position bias, and if it's a shorter ballot, it will turn it down. So the long ballot doesn't cause the problem. The long ballot amplifies the problem, or it reduces it, but the problem is always there. So even if we don't have long ballots, we still have a problem of position bias. Long ballots aren't exactly the problem. Let's dive in a little deeper. It's actually the practice of candidate stuffing. So putting fraudulent candidates onto a ballot. And what that does is that makes large and complex ballots. So the more candidates, the more columns, more rows. It's like, we get a complex ballot, one that's harder for people to process because there's much more information and it's overwhelming. And what happens is this leads to something called cognitive load or cognitive overload, where a person's mental capacity gets overwhelmed. Let's look at what this means conceptually. So when it comes to cognitive harm, the impact of long ballots as a moderator variable takes information that would, generally fit working memory or, be within a reasonable range, and it overloads almost every single voter. You take fast processing time where people can quickly go process it, go in and out. Now it's going to take a long time as it's feeling straining on them. And then the decision clarity becomes fatiguing and overwhelmingly draining. Now, when it comes to the decision-making harm, we take those primary, secondary, and tertiary heuristics, and now we've created such strain that we're pushing down towards those really low-quality tertiary heuristic decision-making. And we want to have less satisficing. Satisficing is very bad, but now we have much more satisficing. And then the thing that matters most in terms of voter behavior, we know that position bias effects are amplifying, so they're getting extreme. Adjacency misvotes are increasing, so more votes are going to the wrong candidate. And name similarity misvotes, I didn't find this on a paper. I'm assuming that one is there. The term cognitive load is a technical term that we use in psychology, and it's also used quite a lot in design psychology. And the idea is that it's that sense of feeling overwhelmed. So let me show you what cognitive load is by trying to help you to feel some cognitive load. So let's do a little bit of math right now, and I'd like you to follow on. So please actually try to do this, because you will not understand the principles if you can't feel the principles. So try to do this in your head. So what is 1 plus 3? Okay. Next, what is 2 times 6 minus 5? Next one, try to do this. What is 7 times 4 plus 9 plus 6? Now, try to do this. What is 3 times 7 minus 18 plus 12 divided by 5? I'm not going to check that, because the point of this is not to see if you got it right or wrong. The point of this was to see when you bailed on this. So I'm sure most of you did this one, 1 plus 3, pretty simple. Some of you probably tried this next one. The third item, I'll bet a lot of you actually thought, forget this, it's too much work. And then this last one, probably a huge amount of you were like, okay, I'm not going to bother. This doesn't matter. And of course, some of you went through and you completed all of them. The point of this is that as the equation got slightly more complex, it became cognitively more demanding on you. So you had to hold more items in your memory, and you had to process them while you're trying to hold on to other things, and then process now the next part of the equation coming in. And that work that you're doing is draining. And as we go on, that sense of this is not fun, I'm not enjoying this, it's not pleasant, causes you to feel demotivated. And that point where a lot of people give up is the point where the cognitive load is so bad that it's not worth the effort. You don't want to continue. And that's the give up point. Now, when it comes to voting psychology, that's the point where people start satisficing, right? They're like, I don't want to go on further because this does not feel good. It's not worth the effort. The return on the investment isn't enough because I don't care. These are two candidates and they're both equal. I found one. Fine, let's move on. I got better things to do. So hopefully this makes the concept of cognitive load a little more clear. So to understand what's going on when people make voting decisions, let's look at a classic memory model. There are newer memory models. This is a slightly older model, but it's still quite popular and used a lot in teaching. And it's absolutely the starting point for understanding basic concepts in memory. So let's use this as a wonderful starting point. According to the model, here's how it works. So we have sensory input. So that's where people take in information through their eyes, their ears. You smell things, you touch, you taste, all of our senses. We have up to around 20 senses. It's not 5 or 6. It's much higher. And we have a sensory memory. So this can last from 0.3 to 10 seconds. So whatever a person focuses on is within their sensory memory. And based on what our perceptual senses pick up as potentially valuable to us, that's what motivates us to zero in and focus on one thing versus another. Whatever we focus on is what we deal with in short-term memory. Often, researchers will refer to this as working memory. There are definitely distinctions. And some people also describe this as where consciousness exists. Remember, there's something like 120 competing consciousness models. So this is not the only way of thinking about it, but I find it helpful to think about short-term memory a little bit like where our consciousness exists. So the idea is that on short-term memory, we can hold on to things for about 10, maybe 20 seconds. But if we don't repeat things, right, we're going to lose them quickly. So if we repeat and we hold on to things, then we're able to hold things up in place. And the idea is that when we're making decision making, we're trying to hold variables so that like that little simple math exercise, you're holding on to the number that you got out of the last part of the equation and you're trying to process the next one and you're doing that while you're thinking about the next thing. And so at some point, you can hold on to these different parts of the equation and process the mathematical answer. But at some point, you'll get overwhelmed and you just can't do it because you're getting overload. So our memory span is something that is limited. Now, the old research used to talk about human memory being 7 plus or minus 2 items. We actually don't use that anymore. So that's an old concept. It's not at all accepted anymore. Today, psychologists, they put it somewhere around like 3 to 5 items is about what the human memory span is. And now if we take that into an election situation, what that means is that the average person can only process about 4 names at once and compare and contrast them. So human memory span overloads. Now, the final part of this model is that if you focus on things and you think about it and repeat it, you might be able to put it into long-term memory where you can then retrieve it and then bring it in and start working on it once again. So the human memory system is a very useful framework for understanding the cognitive limits that we use when we design a ballot or any piece of information that people are interacting with. We already went through this study earlier, and now let's show how bad things get as you add more candidates. So in this study, we have bias curves for ballots with 15, 25, and 35 candidates. Now, what I did is I extracted from the paper and made a little chart showing the proportional difference between being in different places. So they had studied the comparison between the first and the vertex. So what that means is the first position here versus the lowest point down here, the first position here versus the lowest point on this curve, and the first position here versus the lowest point on that. So if we take the 15 candidate ballot, that means there's a 1.18 proportional difference. So if you're the first person on a 15-person ballot, then you have a 1.18 advantage over those who are in the vertex. So basically, you have a really nice advantage at just 15. However, take it up to 25, and now it jumps to 1.26. That's actually more than enough to change a lot of elections. And then we take it to 35, and we're at 1.32. I did not invent these numbers. I did not make up these ratios. These come from study based on thousands of elections, and it follows a consistent pattern. So I hope you can see this is really bad. However, what's a 35-person ballot when you're a Canadian, right? Like we're really hardy Northerners. We like our 90-person ballot. So I did something that you absolutely cannot do. Like if one of my students did this, I would be, I don't know about that. But I did it anyways. So let's say I fit like a simple regression line and I was to extrapolate this really basic trend going up and down. So if we're to go from 35, people on the ballot to 50, now we're at 1.43. And so let's jump to 90. So we're at like 1.7. So these numbers are so off the scale. Now, I don't believe that they would actually look like this. Like I assume things must taper down at some point. The paper that I'm in the process of releasing made predictive models based on the data in 3 of Canada's long ballot elections. And here's an example of 8 predictive models that I produced. The first curve here represents column 1, and the second curve here represents column 2. And I also represented these as a heat map that I superimposed on the ballots so that you could get a sense of where it's a better position to be in and where it's a worse position. And if you think back to the heat maps that we looked at with the eye tracking software, you see it's not a perfect fit, but it's, probably reminds you a little bit of that other pattern that we observed from other independent studies. Here's where things go from bad to worse, because instead of discriminating against individuals based on their last name, what if it was the case that different cultural and ethnic groups whose last names are more represented in different parts of the alphabet found that they were disproportionately given an unfair disadvantage or an unfair advantage? Well, I looked into that, and let's see what that looks like. I couldn't get Canadian data, but I did find some amazing US Census Bureau data. And from their data, I extracted the first letter of all last names and ranked them and counted them. So we can see that when it comes to the distribution of last names, that there's like a few more people in the public who have like a B starting last name, and then an S starting last name is the longest, so all those Smiths. And then I represented them as a proportion, so showing on, say, 100 candidate ballot, this is what they would look like. So if you have an S, you're going to be in the absolutely worst position. And then what I did is I now overlaid the position bias by last name so you can see where you are. So my last name's Cugelman. So I think I have a problem with this. If I want to run for office, I mean, I'm definitely going to do better than the EFGs and those S's, but I don't know if I'd be happy with it. See where your last name is and see if you're happy with position order. Or if you know anyone running for office, why don't you ask them what they think? Here's where things really get bad. Based on the US Census Bureau data, we can see that last names are disproportionately more represented in the alphabet by different ethnic and cultural groups. Now, when I was processing the data, we have a situation where some ethnic groups have smaller and larger representation. So what this is showing is not the proportion of those groups and how often their name is on the alphabet, but how often their name is on the alphabet within their group. So this is not weighted for the size of the different groups. So just keep that in mind. But if you are a person of this ethnicity, then this will tell you statistically where you're more likely to end up on the ballot based on US data. And so what we could see is people of Asian descent might be more commonly represented with an X, just as Hispanic Latino. So then we could step back. So that's not too bad, right? Like sort of probably on par with my last name, right? So you've got a little bit of an advantage being there, but it's, I still rather be in the good place, right? I hope you could see the problem, right? So I don't want to go any more into this, but if this is not the strongest argument I have against the problem of rank order bias in ballots, I just don't know what is. The main takeaway from this video is clear. There's overwhelmingly strong evidence against long ballots, both in theory and within actual elections data. And if undermining democratic fairness isn't reason enough to stop this abuse, the data also shows that long ballots massively amplify the discrimination against candidates simply because of their last name and possibly their ethnocultural background. Worse, it's possible that position bias has been subtly changing elections for decades, quietly giving an edge to those with better names in the close races. But perhaps this is the most troubling issue. Canada's publicly funded broadcaster, an institution tasked with informing the public, spread misleading information that neglected well-known dangers of long ballots. That's where we're headed next. How CBC pushed misinformation under the fake guise of fighting misinformation. And if you found this video helpful, I'm grateful for a thumbs up and subscribe to be notified of the next video. I hope to see you there in the final video of this series.